What if I was to tell you that more than 2,400 years ago, someone was born that could help you to think better, to live better, and even to lead better? Plato, as he's known, is one of the most famous philosophers of all time, but he really fundamentally shifted the way in which we think about reality. He allowed us to understand the power of stories in terms of how they were able to influence so many people so effectively. And he brought us, of course, the amazing work of Socrates that we covered on a previous episode. But in this episode of the Changing Minds podcast, we're going to explore the life and work of Plato and find out exactly how we can learn ideas and insights directly from his work that can help us to change the way in which we're thinking and transform our lives. This one is going to be epic. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Changing Minds podcast. My name is Owen Fitzpatrick, and today we're going to talk about Plato. Last week we talked about Socrates, and I had so much fun talking about Socrates. And today I want to talk about the person who brought us Socrates, right? From the maker of Socrates. And Plato was not the maker in the sense of like Plato was a student of Socrates, but Plato is the person who wrote almost everything he did, or the majority of Plato's writings were really using Socrates in the dialogues. But there's certain ideas that Plato came up with that we believe are more Plato's ideas versus Socrates' ideas. And what we're going to be looking at today is really more of what Plato's known for. We'll touch on a little bit about his life, but primarily what we're going to be doing is examining what are some of the ideas that Plato brought to the table. And most importantly, how can we use those ideas to be able to improve the quality of our thinking and the quality of our lives. So without any further ado, let's talk about who Plato was. So Plato himself was originally called, Plato's actually a nickname, believe it or not. And the nickname was because he was quite broad shoulders, he was big, stocky. His actual name was Aristocles. And Aristocles, or Plato as we came to know him, had broad shoulders and a broad sort of head, bit of a square head. That's kind of mean. I don't know if he had a square head, but he certainly was labeled as someone who was quite broad, therefore that's where he got the name. But he was from an aristocrat, very well-off family in Athens, an Athenian family. He had elite education in gymnastics, in music, in philosophy, and all the different works. So he was born around about 428 or 427 or so, somewhere around that ballpark. And while he was born, obviously the Peloponnesian War was happening, and he became quite disillusioned with politics because of the loss and because of how that went. But he also became fascinated with the work of Socrates. So Socrates was someone that Plato came about and immediately was just fascinated with. And while Plato was in his 20s, he would study under Socrates. And by studying under Socrates, you're really talking about spending as much time listening to Socrates teach, and usually Socrates would teach using questions. So he would spend a lot of time questioning people about their thoughts, about their ideals, about the beliefs that they have. In the previous episode we talked about, which we'll point to towards the end of this episode, we went on a deep dive of Socrates and his Socratic method of questioning. But Plato was observing this incredible method of questioning and learned a massive amount as a result of the time that he spent with Socrates. And so a lot of the influence that Plato was under was certainly a result of how Socrates brought his ideas to the table. So Socrates had a tremendous influence and impact upon who Plato began to be. The execution of Socrates had a profound impact on Plato, and he wrote a number of different books all about it. A number of the dialogues are about that experience. And then afterwards, he went on a bit of a travel, left Athens for a while, came back, founded the Academy, Plato's Academy. And there's a cool little museum, actually, if you ever get to Athens. It's small, but there's a cool museum about Plato and his life that you can visit in Athens, a little bit off the beaten track, but it's good crack. I enjoyed it anyway. And he tried to mentor a ruler in, I think it was Syracuse, Dionysius II of Syracuse. And he tried to help the Dionysius II become what he called the Philosopher King, which is the ideal type of ruler. But he failed. I think he tried a couple of times and he failed both times. So even though he had great ideas, they didn't all practically work. But let's talk about some of his main ideas. And we'll start off by Plato's Republic, which is probably the most famous of all his works. And this is also something we believe is most of it tends to be more about his ideas as opposed to Socrates' ideas. So Socrates is more the man for the questions. You ever want a question asked? Socrates will ask you the questions. But Plato actually had also ideas. And he would slip into Socrates, like, you'd be listening to Socrates asking the question, you go, and that's definitely Socrates. And then all of a sudden he'd use some long-winded metaphor and you go, oh, I don't know, but that's Socrates. Sounds a little bit more Plato. And some of these ideas are certainly the things that he mentioned in the Republic. So in Republic, he talked about justice. He talked about what he calls the concept of Philosopher Kings, which we'll talk about in a moment. He talks about Allegory of the Cave. And he also looked at what is known as the theory of forms. And these are some of the big ideas that Plato really talked about. So let's explore these over the next few moments. First of all, we have the concept of the philosopher king. And this philosopher king is this notion of this ideal ruler, right? And Plato was not a big fan of democracy the way it's sometimes engaged, and we'll talk more about why that was. But he had a lot of issues with democracy in terms of as a form of rule. And so what he would talk about when he talked about the philosopher king is imagine you had someone who was a philosopher who thought deeply, who prioritized virtue, and who made the best decisions for society. And he would set up this ideal person that would be the closest you could get to be a perfect leader. And in many ways, you could argue that people like Marcus Aurelius became the closest you could get to this kind of notion of philosopher king, someone who really was known to be a great ruler in many, many ways. But Plato really believed that this was what it was about. And in Plato's Republic, he kind of positions this concept or this idea. He also positioned the idea of the theory of forms. And this is the notion that, and he actually argued a bit with Aristotle about this, but he believed that you have things like, let's take a circle. You have, whenever you go through the world, you can see examples of a circle. Right? But there's also the concept of a circle. So in your mind, when you think about a circle, you can imagine a perfect circle. Whereas it's hard for you to find a perfect circle in the actual real world. And so the notion was that the theory of forms is that we have, in our mind, we can have a perfect form of something. And that's not the same as the world of the material world, where we've the actual thing. And in many ways, we need to recognize the importance of the form that we create in our own mind, the fact that we have the ability to be able to create this whole world of things being a sort of an ideal state. And he said it's important for us to recognize this. And I think it might sound to ourselves, well, duh, of course, that's obvious. Wasn't obvious back in the day. And he really was bringing that idea to bear. Now, later on, and we'll talk about this in another episode, I'm sure, but Aristotle disagreed with this and was like, look, I get you. I understand where you're coming from, bro, because Plato was actually Aristotle's teacher. But at the same time, Aristotle was saying, look, a large part of what I'm interested in is observing the world. So I want to look at what is as opposed to what could be. And Plato was more sort of looking at the ideal as being an important part of the way in which we conceptualize ideas or thoughts. He also talks about the allegory of the cave. And this is one of my favorite ones because pretty much in a nutshell, this is a story that was told. And what he said was, it was almost like, imagine that there's all these prisoners that were literally born and that never had any sort of experience in the real world. And they're brought into it and they're chained in a cave. So they're chained and all they can see is a wall of a cave. That's all they can see. And what happens is that there could be, let's say, a fire behind them. And then people might walk along next to the fire, pass through the fire. And then as a result of this, all the prisoners in the cave will ever see will be shadows on the wall of the cave. And for them, that is reality. And so the whole idea is that they're perceiving what's in front of them. They're perceiving the wall, which is whatever their experience is, the wall, the shadows, become the real world. And he talked about what would happen if one of them finally escaped and then was led outside of the cave. And if that person, that escapee, was led outside of the cave, he'd be almost blinded by the sun, first of all, but then he would start to see the real world. Now, in the story, again, this escaped prisoner could come back and tell the rest of the prisoners, listen, guys, you've no idea. You know this, all these shadows? They're only shadows. They're not the real world. The real world's actually outside, and it's this, and it's this, and it's this. What do you think all the other prisoners would say? Do you think the other prisoners would say, oh my goodness, really? Oh, wow, that's so cool. No, they wouldn't. No, they wouldn't. You know what they would say? They would say, all right, bro. See your man. Oh, you want to see? There's a real world outside. Oh, it's not the shadow. Tell me. Oh, Mr. Smart. Oh, you're really smart, aren't you? Oh, well done. Oh, you're educating us. I feel so enlightened. That's what would have happened. Now, we might say to ourselves, well, can we really be sure? And all you have to do is look at modern society. It's exactly what's happening all the time, right? Someone comes around and says, well, actually, you know, the emperor has no clothes. And people are like, he does have clothes. He does have clothes. right? It's been happening for thousands of years and it'll continue to happen, sadly, because that's human nature. What we do is we tend to lock into a certain reality. Even the Matrix, the movie The Matrix, is a version of Plato's cave, right? And if you think about it, this is one of the most powerful, most important of all of Plato's ideas, is this notion that what we perceive as reality is just our perception based upon what we're focusing on, just upon what we're perceiving at this moment. The research in neuroscience suggests that what we actually see in the world anyway is not what's there. Our brain is constructing a massive amount of it, making guesses. And as a result of those guesses, it's creating what it thinks is there and it's useful enough. It's good utility for us. But fundamentally, the problem is it's not real. It's not true. And as a result of that, we tend to have disagreements with others because our reality is different to theirs. And therein lies the problem with society. So to me, the allegory of the cave is one of the most important of all the ideas that Plato ever talks about. Let's talk about some of the other works of Plato. He talked about the Apology, which we discussed on the episode with Socrates before, but in a nutshell, this was the defense speech by Socrates. Remember the one that actually made more people want to kill him than beforehand, which is wonderful, right? I love that stubbornness. This is about the unexamined life is not worth living and the importance of being able to do what you need to do and stand up for your principles and stuff. There's the Phaedo, which again expands on this, where Socrates talks about what happens after death and soul's eternal nature. And the guesses are that these weren't really too much of Plato's ideas. They were more likely to be what Plato remembered about what Socrates was sharing. So, those ideas like the defense speech and the Phaedo, obviously there's some dramatization, I'm sure, but fundamentally both of those tend to be what we know more associated with Socrates. There's also what is known as the Symposium, and this is really a series of speeches about love. And this is where the concept of Platonic love, that old chestnut. This is the notion of what Plato called the ladder of love, or what was known as Plato's ladder of love. And it starts with physical attractions, important, but then there's emotional connection, and then there's the love for wisdom and truth, and then finally contemplation of pure beauty, what they call the form of beauty. And really talks about Platonic love, where it's much deeper than just physical love. It's much more intellectual and spiritual matter more than physical desire. And this notion of feeling really close to someone, even if there's no necessary physical attraction from that perspective, which is quite a deep and profound way of looking at love. And once again, we associate that with Plato more than anything else. There's the Timaeus, which is Plato's creation story, talking about how the universe is made from a divine craftsman who arranges everything using the forms. And again, the forms is that theory of forms brought up again, introduces the concept that the world is alive with a soul of its own, which is interesting. And also later in his life, he talked about the laws, which is, whereas the Republic was more, this is how things should be, the laws focuses more on real world laws and government. So it was a little bit more practical, and there's more practical governance and that kind of thing. He kind of compromises. I think maybe after his experiences, which the Philosopher King didn't work out too well, maybe he was thinking more in terms of how this could work. So let's talk about what are the main ideas that we can learn from Plato. I want to talk through 8 different ideas from Plato that we can use to improve the way we think and improve life and improve the world. And we'll start off with pursuing wisdom over popularity. And this is not just what was talked about by Socrates at the end, but this is the notion of philosopher kings versus populism. And so Plato argued that society should be ruled by philosopher kings, as I mentioned, leaders who seek wisdom and truth rather than popularity. In the Republic, he criticizes populism, where leaders cater to public desires instead of what's just and good. Democracy, as he saw it, could lead to demagogues who are charismatic figures who manipulate the masses rather than govern wisely. A true leader, he believed, should be guided by reason and knowledge, not the whims of the majority. Now, we should always be on the lookout for one of these charismatic figures, because ultimately democracy could actually lead to our downfall as a result of that. So just something to pay attention to in the future, of course. Next idea is justice is harmony, balancing reason, spirit, and desire. Plato's view of justice extends beyond laws. It's really about an internal balance between both individuals and society. So in the Republic, he divides the soul into 3 parts, and it's sort of a metaphor, right? And the metaphor is this cool thing about there's like a chariot rider, because that was what they would do back in the day. There was a chariot rider, and he has 2 horses. And so the white horse symbolizes a spirit, which is the passionate emotional drive, and the black horse is desire, and that's the appetite for pleasures and material needs. And Plato talks about how reason, as the chariot driver, has to do their best to be able to make sure that they're guiding the two horses. And the two horses are, one of them is spirit and the other one is desire. So you can imagine how that goes. They're not easy to control, but reason is trying to desperately hang on and control where they go. And it was an interesting metaphor that he used to describe how our brains work or how we were thinking. But what's interesting as well is that we need to recognize that what Plato was saying was reason was like the most important of all. And we could argue nowadays that's not necessarily so, because sometimes we use reason in order to justify the whims of our spirits or desires. So it's not necessarily always good. But in Plato's ideas, rulers used reason, and that was someone who was wise. The guardians were warriors, and these are people that demonstrated courage and had spirit. And then the producers were workers, and these are people that had desire. And he kind of talked about what was known as the noble lie. And this is very controversial because it was almost like he was dividing people into gold, silver, and bronze, I think it was. And gold were like the ones that were destined to be philosopher kings. Silver were ones that were destined to be the warriors. And then there was bronze. But it's kind of a messed up way of sort of saying that, sort of a caste system or, it's a product of his time. So I'm not going to try to cancel Plato. I was going to say not going to cancel NATO, right? We're not going to cancel NATO. Not going to cancel Plato for organizing that. But it was kind of messed up as his ideas come from. But the whole reason and emotional desires, that's an interesting one. It's good for us to understand that we need to learn how to be able to tap into our reasoning more if we can. Number 3, true love is growth. And this is really connected to the whole Platonic love piece. It's important for us to recognize that love and start to embrace it. And this allows us to really find a love for wisdom and virtue as well, which is going to make us happier in the long run. Stories shape our reality is number 4. And this is, to me, one of the most important pieces. It's really important to be mindful of the stories that you buy into, as I call it. He was deeply concerned with the power of storytelling. He would warn people about stories, but he's kind of a hypocrite, if you ask me, because literally almost all of Plato's work is dialogues in the form of stories. So he's like, stories are dangerous. Don't listen to artists. I'm telling you, don't listen to stories. In fact, I remember this one time that Socrates was talking and he said, don't listen to stories. And he said, you know what I'm saying? So Plato was like, no, stories are a bit dodgy. You want to do this and this. You want to stay away from stories. And yet almost all his work was stories. He believed that people, whatever they hear repeatedly, whether true or false, shapes their beliefs and behavior. And I think we can all agree that is true in the modern world too. So very, very powerful stuff. Education is the path to enlightenment. So the allegory of the cave, if you think about it, I think the roots of education is the root of it comes from, I think, to lead people to see. And in the allegory of the cave, people move from illusion to truth, or at least that one person does. They see the shadows and they recognize actually there's a real world outside. But once they tell people, they're rejected. So people often will prefer to lead their lives in ignorance, which is sadly sometimes only too true. Right. And therefore we live with the opinions or media distortions, societal illusions. And the problem today, if I want to, jump on a soapbox for a moment, is you've got the two sides. You've got the people that are the product of conventional media narratives, which is, this is the way the world is. And then you got people, the other side, to say, no, the media lies and everyone's lying and there's a conspiracy and this and that and the other. And at the end of the day, you don't go from one extreme to the other. You go somewhere in the middle, You make mistakes on both sides. And it's just insane to me that we live in this, cave. We're still living in the same Plato's cave for far too long. Rant over. Well, get off the soapbox. Reality is more than what you see. There's the theory of forms. So the material world is just an imperfect reflection of the higher eternal forms or these ideas. And justice, beauty, and goodness exist as perfect forms. And this is something to reach for as well. The visible world that we can see is temporary, but the realm of forms is eternal and true. And philosophers, if they use reason, can access this deeper level of reality, which is, I think, is powerful stuff. Number 8 then is virtue is the key to a good life. Justice, courage, wisdom, moderation. These 4, if you're familiar with Stoicism, as we talked about in a previous episode, again, check out that episode. It was a cool one. But these 4 cardinal virtues will lead you to a good and meaningful life. Wisdom is the ability to think rationally and seek truth. Courage is standing up for what's right, even if it's difficult, like Socrates and the whole death thing. Moderation, controlling desires, like your mind in the chariot. And justice, living in harmony with society and oneself. The importance of practicing virtue. A well-ordered soul, as would be put, cultivates these virtues rather than chasing power and wealth and pleasure alone. Some things that Plato sometimes misunderstood about Plato. Some people say, oh, he hated democracy. No, he hated Athenian democracy because he thought, again, that Athenian democracy led to these demagogues, these very popular figures that were charismatic, to be elected. And as a result of that, he said, that is going to put our society into a way worse place. So he was okay with democracy, but he identified some of the weaknesses and some of the challenges with it. And I think they're fair points. Also, he didn't hate storytellers like, oh, Plato hated storytellers. He hated them. He just was aware of their influence. And again, he used stories himself. So he knew the power of stories. And he was like, yeah, we need to be careful of this. That's all he was saying. And one of the other misunderstandings about Plato was this notion that Plato was in favor of dictatorship, which again goes against the reason why he was so worried about democracy in the first place. But the notion of Philosopher Kings, people were thinking, oh, this is authoritarian. This is one person that ruled them all. But actually, he was talking more about this person having a massive amount of wisdom. So once again, I think it's important to recognize that not everything that we think there is true. And the other thing is, his theory of forms wasn't saying the material world is useless. He was just saying that we need to also look at the fact that it is, in his words, an imperfect version of the ultimate reality. And really bringing this to a final conclusion is that I think ultimately when we think about Plato and we think about the work that he brought in, it's so important for us to really think through this idea of the cave. The fact that we mistake shadows for reality. And our own version of shadows is whatever consumption of the media we pour into. So if you sit down in front of a news channel or you look on things on social media or you follow an influencer, you listen to a certain podcast and you consume that, you may well think that's the way the world is. And I think what's really important for us more than 2,400 years later or whatever it is to understand that just because that's our experience doesn't make it so. And so for us to be able to become, inverted commas, enlightened or at least educated, we need to recognize that the shadows are not necessarily reality. And it's our job to be able to help ourselves to think differently so we can start to make it so that we can escape the caves that train us to believe a certain thing and start to believe better. And that's really what the work that I'm focused on is doing, is helping people to believe better. Starting with your own beliefs about yourself and helping you then to be able to cultivate belief in other folks as well. In the next episode, we're going to get to the final of our 3 great philosophers, Aristotle. We're going to look at some of the most important insights that came from him and also where he kind of disagreed with Plato. But for now, I hope you found this useful. I hope you found this helpful. Please rate and review. Please subscribe to this YouTube channel if you're watching this on YouTube. And if you're listening to this on Spotify or iTunes or any of the different podcast apps, please do rate and review. But for now, take care, be well. May you escape the cave. And may the force, as always, be with you. Bye for now.